Hello, my name is James Cook. I'm an assistant professor of social science here at the University of Maine at Augusta, and you're taking my Introduction to Criminology class. Congratulations. I hope you enjoy it, but you may find yourself in this first week of class thinking, what is criminology? What have I gotten myself into? What are we going to be talking about, and what won't we be talking about? This is a great subject for the first class. I hope to talk about it today with a bit of a discussion that, instead of looking at individual trees, considers the whole forest of the field of criminology. Before we think about what criminology is, we might want to think about what criminology is not. It's not a lot of things. It's not criminal justice, which is all about learning police procedure, learning the skills involved in forensics, handling evidence, custody, the process of prosecution, how the court system works. That's the criminal justice system. Criminology is not that. Criminology is not a lawyerly profession. It's not the same as law school. In law school, people talk a lot about the creation and changing of law, and what the law means and how you read law. This is not a law course. It's not a penology course. Penology is the study of prisons and prisoners. Now, we'll have some discussion of imprisonment and its role in fostering or stopping further crime, but we won't be considering the subject of prisons and prisoners for its own sake, because that's not criminology. Criminology, finally, is also not predominantly a moral exercise. When we think about crime in the United States, and when we talk about crime in the United States, a lot of our talk is moral. It's about whether criminals are good people or bad people, whether an act should be banned or whether people should stop engaging in it, or whether it should stop being criminalized and it's actually a good thing to do. There's a lot of places for this kind of discussion in which we talk about ideas of good and bad, righteous and evil, but this course is not that place, because that's not what criminology is. It's not a place where we share our moral opinions about how we think the world should be. Criminology is the study of what is and how it comes to be. Specifically, criminology is the study of the causes of crime. Why does crime happen? Both for particular acts of crime, that is, why certain individuals commit crimes, why crimes are committed in certain times, in certain places, in certain environments, and in certain circumstances, but not other circumstances. It's also the study of the cause of crime in the sense that we think about why certain acts are judged to be crime. Not whether it's a good idea for them to be judged crime, but why our society chooses certain acts to be criminal and not other acts. Finally, criminology is the study of the social reaction to crime. When someone commits a criminal act, how do elements of society react? And how does that in turn affect the propensity of individuals in particular circumstances, times, and places to commit crimes in the future? That's what criminology is, the study of the causes of crime. Not a moral discussion, not a how-to of police procedure, not a law book, but a study of the causes of crime. Criminology as a field is relatively young, depending on where you place its starting point, between 1 and 2 centuries old. It has developed out of prior traditions, however, in what Auguste Comte, a sociologist, would say is a progression of knowledge, starting before the 18th century with an obsession on supernatural reasons for crime, demonic explanations for crime. If a person commits a crime, it's because demons inhabit the individual, predominated. Theological arguments then would be made about how we should deal with crime as a society as a way of reflecting supernatural dictates, supernatural moral orders. That gave way in the 18th century to metaphysical discussions that place the supernatural aside, but that also remain in the armchair, in a sense. Armchair considerations are considerations that one can make about the world without actually going into it. And it involves taking an idea and thinking about it philosophically, examining the structure of the idea, examining how it breaks down, examining how definitions of an idea change the way we think about it and the way we interact with it, and therefore what we ought to do based on what we come up with in our armchair. There are certain strengths to that. If you believe in a rational worldview, figuring out the rational workings of a system can inform a great deal. But at some point in the 19th and 20th century, people became interested in criminology as a science. Science is based on a Latin word that means knowledge, scientia. And knowledge is gained by observing the world. That's the current emphasis of criminology. Certainly rationality matters. If you're going to do work, it needs to have some kind of logical structure, but there's an emphasis on scientific criteria of measurement, of observation, of taking those observations and judging them against your armchair considerations to see whether they match up. If they do, that's great. If they don't, go back and think some more and then observe again. Replicate your studies to verify that what you think in your armchair might be the way the world works actually matches up with the way the world does work. If we think we know the causes of crime, and many people do, does the empirical pattern of observations of crime match that contention? That's what science is all about. Taking ideas, taking contentions, we would call them hypotheses in the scientific framework, and testing them against observable, measurable reality. So that makes modern criminology a science. We gather data on crime, we gather data on criminal behavior, and we gather it in certain contexts. So at the slide that you're looking at that says criminologists use the scientific method to answer questions such as, why do crime rates vary across time or by culture? Why do crime rates vary by age or gender or race or ethnicity? Why do some people commit crime more than others? Why are some harmful acts criminalized but not others? Each of those questions takes crime as a variable. Crime can be committed or not. It can be committed more. It can be committed less. Those are the variables that we seek to explain. They're the dependent variables. The variables that we seek to explain. The independent variables are those variables that lead to, or if we're not feeling causal, are at least associated with the dependent variable. They're the other things that are supposedly having some kind of effect on crime. Time. As time varies, does the crime rate vary? Culture. Are certain cultures more likely to promote crime than others? Age, gender, race and ethnicity. These are characteristics that vary. They are independent variables, and some of the great contentions in criminology, some of the most sensitive contentions in criminology, have to do with the ideas of how age, gender, and race or ethnicity, these ideas of things that vary, can be associated with widely varying propensities to commit crime and also to be a victim of crime. The whole goal of studying independent variables and how they are associated with, or if we're thinking causally, might lead to A dependent variable, the amount of crime or the presence or absence of crime, is all about the end goal, what can be done to prevent crime. If you know possibly what causes it, then if you can tinker with some of these independent variables, if you can tinker with culture, if you can tinker with conceptions of gender and how people think about masculinity and femininity, can you change the crime rate? That's one of the goals of criminology. It's a practical science. It wants to change the world. It wants to change the world for what criminologists would say is the better. Although we'll see in a few minutes, there are a few reasons to cock your eyebrow at that word, better. Because, after all, if criminology is the study of crime and the study of what leads to more crime or less crime, well, that leaves unanswered the question of what is crime? Criminology, it's almost a definition of a word. Ology means study of, and criminology means the study of crime. But what makes a crime a crime? It's not something that is simply there before people decided it was a crime. People got together and decided what made a crime and what didn't make a crime. There are lots of different definitions of what makes crime crime. It's more complicated than you might think at first. Let's take a literal definition. Paul Tappan offers this. He says, quote, crime is an intentional act in violation of the criminal law committed without defense or excuse and penalized by the state. So, crime is happening when you break the law, the state catches you, you don't really have a mitigating excuse, and you've been penalized. But there are questions about that. Well, where'd the criminal law come from? Why are some acts criminal and not others? What would be a mitigating defense? Why are some defenses mitigating and not others? The law is a little bit more flexible than we might think it is if we just look at the text of the law. And finally, if it's only a crime when you're penalized by the state, why are some crimes penalized by the state and not others? Well, someone is deciding that. And that makes crime an act of individuals. That makes crime a social phenomenon, and that's why it's studied by sociologists. In fact, criminology is a branch of sociology. Okay, so what are the possible answers in this literal definition of criminology for what makes an act criminal? Okay, well, we could think about why it's criminal to murder, but it's not criminal to, say, juggle. Okay? We could think about it in terms of harm inflicted. How often are people hurt by juggling? Okay, well, maybe if you juggle chainsaws for a living, you might get hurt or inflict harm on others, but that's really not the most common juggling act. On the other hand, how are people harmed when you take their life? Okay, so there might be an objective level of harm caused by the behavior. Problem, there are laws in which no person is harmed, curfew laws. Who's harmed when you're out at night past 9 o'clock? If you're a child in certain areas of the country. By that act alone, nobody's harmed. Who's harmed exactly when you jaywalk? Maybe if you cause a traffic accident, but couldn't you just criminalize the causing of a traffic accident? Why is jaywalking a crime if there's no person harmed? And then there are harms that aren't criminal. There are great harms caused by war. The devastation caused by on a battlefield is huge. The devastation caused by PTSD years after a battlefield is done is huge. Landmines years after a conflict kill children. That's a huge harm, right? And we tend to value children in our society. So that's not criminal. Pollution. As we'll see later in class, the pouring of lead into the air has huge, documented harms that have been inflicted upon the population, but people haven't gone to jail for it. What about work safety violations? You don't maintain your machinery. Does the factory owner go to jail? No. Smoking. Smoking causes harm. Smoking causes cancer. Why isn't smoking criminalized? Some people are arguing that it's becoming criminalized, but it isn't right now. So why not? That's a harm. I mean, death is a big harm. Okay, well, harm doesn't work. Some ways we can think about it or tell stories about harm being the reason behind crime. But I have to put a question mark by that one. What about the status of a victim? Are there some kinds of people that merit special protection by the law? What makes an act criminal? Touching someone sexually, status of the victim. Is touching an adult sexually a criminal act? Not necessarily. Is touching a child, sexually speaking, a criminal act? Almost universally. Okay, at least within the United States. So, status of the victim. That seems to have something going on. Okay, there are other kinds of crime that aren't related, though, to the status of the victim. What about the status of the offender? Are there some kinds of people that are more worthy of punishment, who engage in the same action, but are of different ages, or genders, or races? Different ages, it's an easy one. If your kid brother, who's 5 years old, walks up to me and kicks me on the shin, is that kid brother going to be arrested? No, probably not. If you come up to me and you kick me on the shin, are you going to be arrested? Depending on how I feel that day, you certainly could be arrested, and you could have a harm inflicted upon you, the harm of imprisonment. And that would be seen as legitimate, whereas imprisoning a 5-year-old for kicking someone in the shin would not be seen as legitimate. Can people be arrested for acts depending on what their gender is? Absolutely. If that gender status can lead to a harmful environment, yes, as we'll see later in the class. What about race? Are people deemed more worthy of punishment according to their race? It turns out, experimentally speaking, in the United States, yes. In experiments, people have been more likely to deem a person who is black committing a particular act more suitable for jail than a person who is white who commits the same act. There have been studies of actual decisions, not just experimental, hypothetical decisions, in sentencing, that certain people in the United States with darker skin tend to get, for the same acts, harsher sentences. Status of the offender makes the act criminal. That's a social decision. So, if we think about harm, if we think about statuses of certain victims but not others, if we think about statuses of certain offenders and not others, what seems to be, in previous discussions, this literal kind of definition that, well, crime is just crime. It's when the law is violated and there's no excuse and the state penalizes it. Well, it turns out that that implementation of that literal definition is full of moral judgments about people living in society. And so what moral judgments, whose moral judgments are going to influence the criminalization of behaviors? And when the criminal justice process gets activated and when charges are not pressed. So the answer to that question is going to depend, recognizing that criminology is part of sociology, it's going to depend on the sociological paradigms that you studied in Soc 101, Introduction to Sociology. The big three paradigms there are functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. Each has something to say about what it is that leads to these kind of judgments. So, one of the models of who makes criminal law, why certain acts are crimes and other acts are not crimes, is the consensus model. And sociology majors and people who've taken Social 101, you should be among them, should remember the functionalist paradigm. According to the functionalist paradigm, criminal law serves a function to preserve what? The health and stability of a society. Because the criminal justice system is an institution, and all institutions that exist and persist must have some kind of function to preserve the health and stability of society. So there are a few strains of argument about this. The first is that criminal law reflects the interest of members of society more or less evenly, and everybody has a say in shaping that law, and it reflects the elements on which we have a lot of consensus. When there's a huge amount of consensus by all sorts of different groups in society that a certain kind of act is harmful, remember, harm inflicted matters, then after that consensus is reached, we get to say, hey, I guess that should be a crime. So a second strain is an objectivist one. The pluralist strain is one that says people just kind of figure it out and they see what they agree about. An objectivist strain would say, no, there are experts. And these experts, people like, say, criminologists, go out and they study harms inflicted by crimes, and they study all sorts of ideas of what harm means, and they measure it very carefully with their slide rules. And then they suggest as experts what the best way would be to mitigate harm. And thanks to those experts, we have an objective basis upon which harms are decided, and therefore categories of crimes are decided. So whether you're a pluralist or an objectivist, if you are a functionalist, depends on whether you think a consensus does underlie the law's definition of what behaviors are criminal. Is there a consensus in our society about the crimes that exist? Should consensus be underlying that? Well, what if 90% of people agree? Does that mean that 10% of the people are necessarily wrong? And if 10% of the population might possibly know better than the other 90%, is that suggesting that there's an elite set of people who know better than the rest of us? These are not easy questions to answer. I don't think there is one easy answer to those questions, and that's why there continue to be pluralist and objectivist strains. Okay, so 3 paradigms: functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. We've talked about functionalism. What about conflict? The conflict model says that all of this kind of stuff is really subjective, and there is not an objective basis of harm that leads to criminalization. Instead, the belief is, those with the power are deciding. That the law disproportionately reflects the interest of a powerful minority, this 10%, or if you were in the Occupy movement, you might say the 1% most powerful small minority within society. So what would this state serve then? The state defines crime. The state serves certain interests according to the conflict model. What interests are those? Those who currently have power. From a gender model, that would be men. Those who currently have power from a race conflict model, that would be white Americans. Who else has power? From an economic point of view, a class point of view, it would be people with wealth and power. And so the idea would be that, according to the conflict model, crime represents the values of the victors, the values of men, the values of white people, the values of people who are wealthy and who have vast property. They would say, is it a mistake that we find that crack cocaine versus powder cocaine leads to a sentence 20 times as much? Crack cocaine is used by black Americans, white Americans predominantly use powder cocaine. This is called a sentencing disparity. Is it a coincidence that so many of the crimes on the books are about protection of property and keeping what you have? Who does that matter most to? Those who have the most. So this is a really contentious idea, and it tends to get people's blood running, either in support of this model or in opposition to the model, because it says a lot about motivations, and that motivations really, rather than consensus and rather than expertise, are driving what creates crime. Well, there's a third paradigm, that's symbolic interactionism. And in symbolic interactionism, everything is also relative. There is no one objective best solution, but people come to an understanding of what the best solution would be in defining crimes. That's a relativism possibly without conflict. If you recall from Introduction to Sociology, symbolic interactionism is about people interacting, people talking to each other, people sharing symbols, people sharing values, people sharing ideas. They're spreading through social networks of contact with one another, building cultures in which certain actions are highly valued and other actions are marginalized and made deviant. These ideas that you are who you know leads to, in differential association theory, as we'll see later in the semester, the idea that criminals end up being people who have been surrounded by criminals in their social environment. That if you want to know why people commit crime, it's because their friends do. There's a second kind of symbolic interactionist idea that says, well, why do some people commit crimes? Maybe it's because they get labeled as criminals. Are there certain people in school who get labeled as the troublemaker? What happens when someone gets labeled as a troublemaker? Does the label come back to bite them? Is it hard to escape from those labels? That's a symbolic interactionist idea. Now you notice this is not an idea that's at the grand scale of an entire society. It's not talking about race and class and gender for the whole society. It's talking about individual people. Sam Davis, who gets called a punk in school and starts to, react accordingly when people keep putting him in that category. Or, Louisa Davis, who grew up in a neighborhood where everybody did certain things in order to get by, and it was just the way it was done. And she grew up doing that, and so she came to do that herself. Differential association theory. That's a symbolic and an interactionist way of explaining crime. Criminology is really just a subset of sociology. So if you understand sociology, you can understand the broad divisions in all the different theories that explain crime. And yeah, there are a lot of them. So, if we think about what the definitions of crime are, to review, there's the legalistic one that says crime is what a judge or a jury determines to be a violation of existing law. So, if that's true, then the focus of criminology should be on those who are observed committing crime, those who are caught committing crime, and those who are convicted of a crime. Problem. What about those who never get caught? Right? If you focus on people who've been convicted of crimes, what a judge or a jury determines to be a violation of existing law, the people who get sent away, you're dealing with a subset of people, those people who've been caught. So if you then run, intelligence or coping tests, you'll find out that, boy, the people who commit crimes seem to be relatively low in intelligence, when maybe that might be because they're the ones that got caught. Maybe they're the ones that are not good at it. So Edwin Sutherland comes along and says, okay, let's include the people who didn't get caught. Let's include a crime as, in this modified legalistic sense, a harmful act that has the possibility of being penalized if the state found out about it. Whether or not the penalty is implemented, if the person did the thing, if it's a punishable act, then you would include that in crime. All of a sudden, the object of study, the question becomes, why are some people punishable but not punished, when other people who are punishable are punished? So the focus of criminology becomes, why are there white-collar offenders? The entire banking system almost collapsed a few years ago. Who's gone to jail? Billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars have been lost. And the people responsible for that haven't gone to jail. This guy holds up a corner store for $500, which is nothing compared to billions of dollars. If we're talking about actual measurable harm, and yet he's gone away for 15 years. Why is it that speeding is this thing that is punishable? A police officer could do that. You're going 5 miles an hour over the speed limit, you're breaking the law. But if you go 5 miles an hour over the speed limit, you're not going to get arrested. I bet you can tell me what the amount is that you have to go above the speed limit to get arrested. That's the difference between punishable and actually punished. Between formal law and modified law. What about marijuana laws? There are sheriffs around the country who are now saying, if small growers will just come to us and register with us, we're not going to bother them because we're going to go after the big growers. Or there are some places, sheriffs saying, even though federally it's a crime to grow marijuana, at the state level it's not, so I'm just going to look the other way. Distinction between punishable and actually punished comes into view. Then there are people who say, expanding that out, that it's not just about the law, because that's all still about the law. If you think about it, right, crime is what is punishable. But Sullen and Mannheim began to try to push that definition outward, and they say, crime is really not just everything that's a violation of law. This formal kind of political document that, says here's the behavior and here's the punishment. There's a more informal version of a law. It's called a norm, which is a social expectation for behavior that is sometimes informal. It may not be written down anywhere, and yet it still could be a crime. You still could be punished if you do it. In sociology, we call that deviance. When people engage in a deviant act, even if it is strictly legal, they may be punished as if they are criminals. So then the focus of criminology becomes an explanation of why it is that certain people engage in these deviant acts that result in punishment. Sometimes informal punishment, but punishment nonetheless. Why do certain people smoke? And if you're a smoker, you know about the informal punishments that come out if you smoke. Why do some people wear clothes that they shouldn't? And what happens to them? Can we think of that as just a variation of criminal activity in a society? What's the process by which those norms are created? Okay, so now we're thinking about crime, and all of a sudden it's getting this really kind of loose and vague definition. It's just stuff that upsets the normative order. Then we come back to critical criminology, saying that, it's all about deviance. It's about violations of norms, social expectations for behavior, but that there are certain people who set it. Certain people who are in a position where they're allowed to set that. It's subjected to a political filter. Who gets to say what's crime? Who gets to say what's not crime? Political power, economic power. And that leads to a response to even acts that are not strictly criminal in a legal sense. Wow, okay. So what I hope you come away from this lecture with is a sense of confusion, of a lack of certainty. Because there is a lack of certainty when it comes to thinking about just what crime is, and therefore just what criminologists are studying. I want you to be skeptical when you hear someone talking about crime. Why is that a crime? And someone says, well, that's just because that's the way it is. Because it's just wrong. Ignore that word just and say, well, why is it wrong? Where does the wrongness come from? And who is making that decision? How is that decision being made? There are many theories of crime, going from the most formal legal definitions to the most general and contentious arguments about social conflict, and many ideas about what makes an act criminal and what makes a person defined as a criminal. Why are all these theories around? I think it's because there's no one obvious answer, because all of them have something valuable to say about what crime is. I want you to be skeptical in this class. When you hear a claim, I want you to look for, because criminology is a science, I want you to look for the evidence. When someone says, it's just the way it is, whether that person using the word just is coming from a conflict point of view or a functionalist point of view or symbolic interactionist view, ignore the just. Look for the evidence. And ask yourself, what doesn't fit within this definition? I want you to question skeptically what you read. Let's think about Frank Hagen's text, pages 7 to 8. I want you to question this distinction between mala in se and mala prohibita, right? Mala in se, crimes are ones that are universally condemned, irrespective of political or economic systems. No matter what the system is under which you run, no matter what the culture is, no matter what the political system is, these are acts that are just seen as bad in and of themselves, like murder, assault, rape, and theft. Whereas mala prohibita crimes are ones that are bad because they're prohibited. They're bad because in particular times, in particular cultures, people decide they're bad, but not in others, like traffic violations. It used to be a crime to turn right on red. It's not anymore. Gambling. Gambling in some places is criminal, in some places it's not. By some people, like the state, it's legal, but by people who aren't taxed or licensed by the government, it's illegal, right? So that would be mala prohibita. The government decides, and based on particular bounds of culture and time, and it's all based on a discussion. Well, those are classic textbook definitions in criminology. If you open up this textbook, if you open up another textbook, if you open up a third textbook, you'll see it in there, this distinction. Well, there are mala in se crimes and mala prohibita crimes. But I want you to consider whether those classic definitions are good ones. Question it. Is the distinction between mala in se and mala prohibita really about time and place specific versus universal acts? Think about that. Murder, assault, rape, and theft. Did you know that until 1985, it was not a criminal act to rape your spouse? You couldn't actually rape your spouse in Maine. This is in the state of Maine. And before 1975, in no state in the nation could a husband possibly rape a wife. It wasn't conceived of in the criminal law because marriage was conceived of as consent, a consent that was everlasting. That's not the way we think of it, culturally now. So that it is possible for a husband to rape his wife. It is also possible for a wife to rape her husband, because the definition of rape was just changed in the last year to 2 years in terms of implementation, so that it's about penetration of any orifice by any object for sexual reasons. That becomes rape. It is now possible for men to be raped by women in a way that it was not possible for under the law before. Is that now all of a sudden universal? No. Irrespective of political or economic systems? No, it was decided in the political system. What about assault? What about theft? Are there certain groups of people that used to be assaulted regularly and that was okay under the law? Yes. They could have things stolen from them. They could have everything stolen from them. Before 1865 in this country, we had a system of legal slavery. Mala in se, universal, irrespective of political or economic systems. What about murder? Okay, well now that is a really loaded term, murder, because it means killing that we say is bad. But there are forms of killing that are not thought of as bad in all times and places. There are people who have literally gotten away with killing. It hasn't been considered murder. In some societies, there are honor killings. If someone hurts or kills a member of one family, that family can go and kill someone else, and the police will look the other way. They won't be charged with the crime. What kinds of death can one person cause for another person and get away with in our society? Think about it. They exist. Murder is a cultural definition, and it's not universal in deciding what fits and what doesn't. There's certain people who can kill. There's certain people who can't at certain times in certain places. And criminology is all about figuring out those times and places, the circumstances in which crime is defined to occur. Okay. If we think about universal crimes, right? One of the things that's been described is that all cultures that have been studied look dimly upon indiscriminate lying, cheating, stealing, and killing. Well, notice he put in the word indiscriminate. That's a wiggle word right there, right? If you think about the definition of crime, right, it's mitigating circumstances. Well, what mitigates? What's the wiggle? It's not true that all cultures that have been studied look dimly on lying, cheating, stealing, and killing. Cutting in line. If you go certain places in the world, it's expected that you'll cut in line. And if you wait in a line and try to form a line, you'll never get to the front of the line because everybody else is wandering around going this way and that way, and it's considered to be okay. Property, stealing. We have in our country a system where if somebody's going to be building a highway, they could take your land. Is that stealing? Oh. Well, it's happened. Entire neighborhoods have been lost in cities due to eminent domain in the United States. Killing. We already talked about that. Some kinds of killing are tolerated in American society and in other societies. Right? We live not in the universal. We never live in the universal. We sometimes tend to think of it as universal because we look around and it's all we've known. It's all we've seen, which is why sometimes it's valuable to look at other times and other places. One great place to look in other times and places is the FBI vault. Okay, Google the FBI vault, V-A-U-L-T, and you can find really interesting cases where the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was called out to engage in an investigation of John Denver. You know that guy? He died 15 years ago or so, but he was on the Muppets, right? Glasses, and he played the guitar. Well, they were investigating him because they decided he was too much against the war in Vietnam. That's not a crime, but the FBI was investigating him as if it was. We go back in time, roughly the same period, Rock Hudson. If you don't know that name, look him up. He was a famous actor, a heartthrob, but the FBI was investigating him for the crime of being gay, and it was building up a dossier of evidence criminalizing homosexual behavior. Until relatively recently, 10 to 15 years ago, in a number of states in the country, it was against the law to engage in homosexual activity. Now, there are a number of states in which, including the state of Maine, in which it's perfectly acceptable and legal for same-sex couples to get married. Not universal. Okay. Look at the vault, and you'll find in the FBI a change over time in what behaviors are considered to be beyond the pale and certainly deviant and worthy of investigation by an office that's all about investigating crime. And the Bureau of Justice Statistics is operated by the FBI. Why are they investigating Rock Hudson? Why are they investigating John Denver? Okay, times change, reasons change. I want you to question your author, right? Question your author. Don't be silent, and don't take everything Frank Hagen, as good an author as he is, don't take everything he says for granted. Question things like mala in se. Question things like mala prohibita. On page 15, he talks about the cost of crime. Question that. Okay? He himself says it's difficult or possibly, might be impossible to measure the economic cost of crime, but there are estimates, and he goes on to show you some. The National Center for Victims of Crime, and he gives a citation. Well, it turns out if you go to that citation in the back of the book, it doesn't work anymore. So where could you find an estimate on the costs of crime? Try this place. Center.edu, cost of crime.pdf. Sometimes we have to update what goes missing in a book because time passes and the facts change, sometimes so fast that we can't stay still from one edition to the next. Question me. Did I say something today that you think is factually unsupportable? That actually is contradicted by the facts? Well, it might be from another point of view. I don't want to get bogged down in moral discussions about whether by your moral system versus another student's moral system the crimes are actually good or bad, but I would like to hear from you if you think that the explanations for why it is that crimes get defined the way they do seem to work or don't, or why the theories about why certain kinds of people engage in crime versus other kinds of people in some kinds of circumstances versus other kinds of circumstances, whether that works or doesn't work. I want you to question, right? Because the most useful university education is one that renders me useless. By the end, you don't need me anymore. And you can go out and you can collect that information and you can build that understanding yourself. And sometimes that means questioning authority to make your own knowledge and build your own skill in gaining knowledge. Be active. Send me an email, james.m.cook@maine.edu. Give me a call, 621-3190. Let's talk about this stuff. It's contentious. It's controversial. There's no consensus on what the answer to all these questions about the causes of crime and the definition of crime are, which makes it a really interesting class. I think it makes it a fun class. It also makes it one in which discussion and back and forth conversation is essential. I look forward to your questions. I look forward to your comments. I look forward to the rest of the semester. And we'll be starting again with another lecture next week. Until then, keep at it with your readings here and start to pay attention to the work that I'm going to be expecting you to produce. Have a good week.